The reckoning begins. The sun sat high in the sky, casting long shadows across the sleepy neighborhood of Westbrook. It was the kind of place where everything seemed in perfect order. Trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and clean sidewalks. It was also the kind of place where Sergeant Kyle Mercer believed he had absolute control. 20 years on the force had made him a firm believer in his instincts. He was known for his no-nonsense approach, a man who saw the world in stark shades of black and white. In his mind, there were good people and bad people. And the bad people, well, they didn't belong in places like Westbrook. Cruising slowly down Maple Avenue, he spotted her, a black woman, mid-40s, athletic, and moving with a confidence that irked him. She jogged past a sleek black BMW, her earbuds firmly in place, her expensive running gear hugging her toned frame. Nothing about her seemed suspicious, except for the fact that she didn't acknowledge his presence. Mercer tightened his grip on the wheel. He was used to people giving him a nod, a wave, some sign that they respected the badge. But she just kept running. His instincts flared. Something about her was off. His cruiser rolled to a slow stop, tires crunching against the pavement. With practiced ease, he stepped out, hand resting lightly on his belt. He wasn't reaching for his weapon, but the position was deliberate. A silent message. The woman slowed her pace, yanking out an earbud, beads of sweat rolling down her temple. She barely looked fazed. "Something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice even. Mercer studied her, his eyes scanning for any tell. Nervousness, avoidance, hesitation. There was none. "Where you coming from?" His tone was firm, edged with authority. She exhaled, glancing back toward the direction she came. "Home. Just finishing my run." "Where's home?" Mercer pressed. Her expression shifted slightly, as if she was suddenly aware of where this was going. "A couple blocks down." "You got ID on you." That was it. The moment everything changed. She stiffened just slightly, a tension creeping into her stance. It was barely noticeable, but Mercer caught it. He'd seen it before, a subtle resistance. "For what?" she asked, her voice calm, yet firm. Mercer straightened. He didn't like being questioned, just making sure everything checks out. She exhaled sharply, placing her hands on her hips. "You pulled over a woman jogging in broad daylight because you think I'm a threat." He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. A short laugh escaped her lips, but there was no humor in it. She reached for her phone. "You know what? Let's just call someone who actually enforces the law correctly." Mercer took a step forward, not aggressively, not violently, but deliberately. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Show me some identification." Her fingers tightened around her phone. Mercer noticed. To him, that was an escalation. In a fraction of a second, his mind made the decision. His hand snapped forward, grabbing her wrist before she could do anything else. "What the hell?" she shouted, jerking back. Mercer's grip was ironclad. "You're resisting." "I'm not resisting anything. Let go of me." The words barely registered. In his mind, he had already reached a conclusion. She was being uncooperative. He twisted her arm behind her back, metal cuffs clicking open. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," he said, his voice automatic, rehearsed. The world around them seemed to narrow. The jogger's breathing was controlled, but the look in her eyes was something Mercer couldn't quite decipher. "You're making a mistake," she gritted out. Mercer ignored her. The law was on his side, or at least that's what he always believed. Across the street, a man on his porch pulled out his phone. A woman watering her plants froze, watching. A small ripple of unease spread through the quiet neighborhood. Mercer keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I have a 10 to 15. Female suspect, refusing to identify herself. Send a unit for transport." She let out a bitter chuckle under her breath. "You really think this is gonna go your way, huh?" Mercer clenched his jaw. He was done talking. That's when another voice sliced through the air. "Excuse me, officer. What exactly is going on here? Mercer turned, annoyance flickering in his gut. A well-dressed man in his 50s stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets. He didn't look like a neighbor. He looked like someone with authority. "Sir, I need you to step back," Mercer ordered. The man didn't move. Instead, he looked past Mercer, locking eyes with the woman in cuffs. Then he looked back at Mercer. "You arrested her for jogging." She refused to comply with an investigation. The man's expression darkened. "That's so." Mercer frowned. Something felt off. Before he could say anything else, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Tinted windows, unmarked plates. The kind of vehicle Mercer had seen before. The kind of vehicle that belonged to someone with pull. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped Captain Marcus Reynolds. Mercer felt his stomach drop. His commanding officer stormed toward them, his jaw set tight, his movements precise. The crowd murmured. Mercer straightened, trying to maintain control of the situation, but something felt wrong. Reynolds stopped in front of them, his face unreadable as he looked from Mercer to the woman still in cuffs. Then he spoke. "Uncuff her." Mercer blinked. "Sir." Reynolds' voice dropped, sharp as steel. "I said, uncuff her. Now." Something inside Mercer twisted. "But, sir, do you even know who you just put in handcuffs?" Reynolds asked, his voice dangerously low. Silence stretched between them. Mercer's grip loosened just slightly. She refused to identify herself. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "That's because she didn't have to." And then the woman spoke. Her voice was calm, controlled. "My name is Chief Olivia Carter." Mercer stopped breathing. The words hit like a sledgehammer, knocking the air out of his lungs. Chief. Chief. The woman he had just humiliated, handcuffed, and treated like a suspect was his boss. She let the words settle in, watching him process what had just happened. And then, with a voice sharp as a blade, she added, "And you just made the biggest mistake of your career." The weight of her words crashed down on him. The crowd watched. The cameras recorded. The whispers spread. Mercer swallowed hard. For the first time in his 20 years on the force, he felt fear. Not the kind that came from facing danger. The kind that came from knowing his entire world was about to come crashing down. The unraveling. Sergeant Kyle Mercer had made plenty of arrests in his 20-year career, but none had ever left him feeling like this, like the ground had just crumbled beneath his feet. The moment Chief Olivia Carter uttered those words, the world around him seemed to warp. The whispering crowd, the recording phones, the look of cold, quiet rage on Captain Reynolds' face. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And it was only the beginning. The weight of the moment. The cuffs clicked open with an almost deafening finality as Mercer removed them from Chief Carter's wrists. She didn't flinch, didn't rub her skin, didn't lash out. She simply stared at him, her gaze heavy with something far worse than anger. Disappointment. Mercer could handle anger. He could handle yelling, threats, even defiance. But disappointment, that was different. That was something that gnawed at the inside of a man and didn't let go. Chief Carter exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders before addressing Captain Reynolds, ignoring Mercer entirely. "Marcus, would you be so kind as to explain why one of my officers thought it appropriate to harass me on my morning run?" Her voice was calm, controlled, deadly. Captain Reynolds' jaw tightened, and Mercer could see the barely restrained fury behind his superior's eyes. "Sergeant Mercer is relieved of duty until further notice," Reynolds said stiffly. "Turn in your badge and weapon." Mercer felt his stomach churn. His fingers hovered over the badge pinned to his chest, his pride warring with the reality slamming into him. His mind screamed for him to say something, to defend himself, to justify his actions. But what could he say? That she looked suspicious. That his instincts told him she didn't belong. That her confidence unsettled him. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. And worse, he was realizing, with sickening clarity, that none of it was justifiable. Silently, he unpinned his badge, placing it into Reynolds' outstretched hand. Then, with a weight heavier than he had ever felt before, he unbuckled his holster and handed over his weapon. It felt like surrender. The watching crowd murmured among themselves. The phones were still recording. Mercer clenched his jaw, swallowing down the bitter taste of regret. But the worst was yet to come. A public reckoning. The gathered onlookers weren't just standing there. They were watching history unfold. Some with triumph, some with quiet satisfaction, and some with sheer disbelief. "Wow," someone muttered. "Never thought I'd see the day." "About damn time someone put these guys in their place," another voice chimed in. Mercer forced himself not to react. He kept his expression neutral, even as his gut twisted. He had always believed he was a good cop. Firm, fair, by the book. But now, under the scrutiny of those watching, he felt exposed. Like the truth of his actions had been peeled back, leaving nothing but raw, undeniable reality. He had misjudged her. He had profiled her. And now he was paying the price. Chief Carter finally turned her gaze back to Mercer. There was no gloating, no smugness, just a hard, unwavering stare. "You think your badge gives you the right to determine who belongs where?" she asked, her voice soft but cutting. "You think jogging while black is suspicious activity?" Mercer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "You looked at me," she continued, "and decided I was a suspect before I even said a word. You didn't see an officer. You didn't see a citizen. You saw a problem." Her words sliced through him like a blade. "I've spent my entire career fighting to make sure officers like you don't ruin what this uniform is supposed to stand for," she said. "And today, you proved just how much work still needs to be done." Mercer's throat felt dry. He had nothing to say, no defense that would hold up under the weight of what had just happened. The air was thick with unspoken truths. And then, with a simple shake of her head, Chief Carter turned away. The walk of shame. Captain Reynolds didn't look at him as he spoke. "Go home, Mercer." Mercer felt a fresh wave of humiliation crash over him. Just like that. His career, his reputation, unraveling in a single moment. But he knew arguing wouldn't change anything. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Without a word, he turned toward his cruiser, feeling the eyes of the crowd burning into his back. Each step felt heavier than the last. As he slid into the driver's seat, he hesitated for a moment, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. His heart pounded, his pulse roaring in his ears. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the mistake. A career-ending, life-altering mistake. And he knew, deep in his gut, that this wasn't something he could just walk away from. Not this time. Not ever. The storm begins. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the weight of everything that had happened was finally starting to settle in. His phone was already blowing up. Missed calls from his precinct. Text messages from fellow officers. But it was the news alerts that sent an icy chill through his veins. West Rook Sergeant suspended after racial profiling incident. Chief Olivia Carter harassed, cuffed by her own officer. Viral video shows Sergeant Mercer's disastrous mistake. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the articles, each one recounting the incident in brutal detail. And then there were the comments. Hundreds, thousands, some defending him, some calling for his head. But one in particular made his breath catch in his throat. It was from a former colleague, one who had retired years ago. "You're about to find out what it's like on the other side of that badge, Kyle. Hope you're ready." Mercer's stomach turned, because for the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't. The weight of consequences. Sergeant Kyle Mercer had always believed in control. Control over his precinct. Control over the streets. Control over his own reputation. But now, sitting alone in his dimly lit living room, The weight of his badge no longer on his chest, he felt something foreign and suffocating, the loss of control. His entire career had been built on instincts, on judgment calls, on the certainty that he could assess a situation and act accordingly. But today, his instincts had failed him. His judgment had crumbled in front of a recording crowd. And now the world was watching him burn. The flickering blue light from his TV screen cast shadows against the walls. But Mercer barely noticed. The volume was muted, yet the headlines at the bottom of the news broadcast screamed at him. Westbrook officer suspended after racial profiling incident. Chief Olivia Carter speaks out against police misconduct. Viral video sparks department-wide investigation. His own name flashed across the screen, bold and damning. Mercer swallowed hard, his hand gripping the armrest of his chair as his eyes remained locked on the words that seemed to brand him as a villain. The viral video had spread like wildfire. News outlets had picked it up, activists had condemned it, and even fellow officers, his own brothers in blue, were either going silent or, worse, turning against him. He grabbed his phone off the coffee table, his fingers hovering over the screen. More missed calls, more messages, but it was one name that made his stomach lurch: Sergeant Daniel Rourke. Mercer exhaled sharply. Rourke, his oldest friend on the force, the one who always had his back. He hesitated, then tapped the screen. The call rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Jesus, Mercer, what the hell have you done?" Mercer closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. He hadn't even said a word, and already Rourke sounded exhausted. "It's not what it looks like, Dan." His own voice sounded strained, foreign. "That right? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like what it is." There was no anger in Rourke's tone, just a heavy disappointment. The same look Chief Carter had given him, the same weight that had settled in his chest the moment those cuffs had clicked shut. "I thought she was." Mercer started, but Rourke cut him off. "Yeah, we all know what you thought." A pause. "Doesn't matter now, does it?" Mercer gritted his teeth. "So what? You called just to lecture me?" "No, I called because IA is coming for your ass, and you need to get your head on straight before they rip you apart." Internal affairs. The department's internal watchdogs, the ones who determined whether a cop got to keep his badge or lost everything. "You need to be smart about this," Rourke continued. "They're looking at your past cases, your record, your stops. They're gonna find anything they can use against you, Kyle." Mercer sat up straighter, dread curling in his gut. "My record's clean." "Is it?" Rourke's voice was quiet now. "Because I've been thinking about that kid last year, the one you stopped outside the hardware store." Mercer stiffened. That was different. Was it? The silence that followed was heavy. Mercer could feel the ghosts of every questionable stop, every snap judgment, every moment where his instincts told him someone didn't belong. He had never thought twice about them. Until now. "Look, I gotta go," Rourke finally said. "But if I were you, I'd start thinking real hard about how this plays out. Because this ain't going away, Kyle. Not this time." The line went dead. Mercer set the phone down, his hands resting on his thighs as he stared at the floor. Not this time. The backlash. The backlash had started small. Social media outrage, local activists demanding accountability. But within hours, it had escalated. The department had been forced to issue a statement. The Westbrook Police Department does not condone racial profiling or misconduct of any kind. Sergeant Mercer has been placed on unpaid suspension pending a full investigation. Mercer felt his pulse pound as he read the words. Unpaid suspension. Pending investigation. The writing was on the wall. His name wasn't just attached to the story anymore. He was the story. The comments under the department's post made his skin prickle. This is exactly why people don't trust the police. Imagine if she wasn't his boss. Imagine if she was just another black woman jogging alone. He shouldn't just be suspended. He should be fired. This isn't a mistake. It's who he is. Mercer clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching with the urge to respond, to defend himself, to say that it wasn't like that. But wasn't it? He had stopped her for nothing. He had treated her like a suspect. He had thrown cuffs on her the moment she challenged his authority. And now, people were seeing him for what he had refused to see in himself. The knock on the door. A sharp knock at the door snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But then another knock came, harder this time. With a sigh, he pushed himself up and moved toward the door. When he swung it open, his stomach dropped. Chief Olivia Carter stood on his porch. No uniform, no badge, just her, dressed in a black blazer, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Mercer swallowed hard. "Chief. Formerly your chief," she corrected, stepping past him into the house without waiting for an invitation. Mercer shut the door, his mind racing. "What are you doing here?" Carter turned, folding her arms across her chest. "We need to talk." Mercer exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "Haven't I been through enough today?" Carter arched a brow. "You think you had a rough day." That shut him up. She took a slow step forward. "Do you have any idea how many people have reached out to me since this morning? How many times I've had to explain why one of my own officers thought it was appropriate to treat me like a criminal on the street?" Mercer said nothing. "You embarrassed the department," she continued. "You embarrassed yourself." His fists clenched at his sides. "I made a mistake." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that all it was?" Mercer opened his mouth, but hesitated. Because if he said yes, he'd be lying. This wasn't just a mistake. It was the culmination of every unchecked bias, every snap decision, every unspoken assumption he had made about who did and didn't belong. And for the first time, he was seeing it clearly. Carter sighed, shaking her head. "You're going to have to live with this, Mercer. Not just the suspension. Not just the media storm. The truth. The fact that this moment, this choice, is going to define you." Mercer swallowed the lump in his throat. She stepped back toward the door, her hand resting on the knob. "You've got a decision to make, Sergeant. You can go down swinging, blaming everyone but yourself, or—" She trailed off, giving him one last, pointed look. "You can change." The door opened, cool night air swept in. And then she was gone. Mercer stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been. For the first time in his career, he didn't know what to do. But one thing was certain. Everything had changed. The mirror and the mask. Kyle Mercer wasn't used to feeling powerless. For 2 decades, the badge on his chest had been more than just an emblem. It had been a shield, a symbol of control, of authority. It had defined him. But now, stripped of it, he was just another man staring into a mirror, forced to confront the reflection that he had spent years avoiding. He barely recognized himself. Dark circles hung under his eyes, remnants of a sleepless night spent cycling through the fallout of the previous day. His stubble had grown in thick, his usually squared shoulders sagging under the weight of something heavier than exhaustion. Shame. The world outside his front door was moving forward. The news cycle was still burning with the embers of his mistake, feeding the fire with every replay of that viral video. Every frame, every second, exposing his failure to the world. Mercer's phone sat face up on the bathroom counter, another headline glowing on the screen. Westbrook Sergeant under investigation for racial profiling incident. Calls for termination grow. He let out a slow, shuddering breath. It was happening. The one thing every cop dreaded, yet few ever believed would come for them. Accountability. And it wasn't just coming from the public, it was coming from inside the department. From people he had worked with, people he had trusted, people who were now questioning everything about him. Mercer rubbed a hand down his face and turned away from the mirror. He couldn't keep standing there, drowning in his own reflection. He needed answers. and he knew exactly where to start. The reckoning at the precinct. When Mercer stepped into the Westbrook Police Department for what felt like the last time, the shift in energy was immediate. He wasn't greeted with nods or casual greetings. He wasn't acknowledged with the usual respect given to a veteran officer. He was a ghost, a walking headline, an infection that no one wanted to be seen touching. As he moved through the station, he could feel the weight of 100 conversations that stopped the moment he entered the room. Officers who had once shared beers with him at the bar now kept their gazes locked on their desks, pretending he wasn't there. But it wasn't just avoidance. It was something else. Fear, and Mercer knew why. They weren't just looking at him like a man who had made a mistake. They were looking at him like a warning. Like proof that if it could happen to him, it could happen to any of them. He walked into Captain Reynolds' office without knocking. He didn't have time for protocol. Reynolds barely looked up from his desk. That was fast. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" Mercer said, his voice low, tight. The captain leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something Mercer wasn't sure he had ever seen before. Pity. "You think I didn't warn you, Kyle?" Reynolds said. "You think I haven't been warning all of you for years?" Mercer stiffened. "This department has been a powder keg for a long time," Reynolds continued. "And you just happened to be the one who lit the match." Mercer clenched his fists. "So that's it. I get thrown to the wolves and everyone else just keeps pretending like this is new." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, standing up slowly. "Look around you, Mercer. The world isn't what it was 10 years ago. Hell, even 5 years ago. People aren't just taking this lying down anymore. Cameras are everywhere. Eyes are everywhere. And you made the wrong call in broad daylight, in front of the wrong person." Mercer swallowed hard. "I didn't." He stopped himself. Because deep down, he knew what he was about to say wasn't true. And Reynolds knew it too. "You stopped her because she was black in a neighborhood you thought she didn't belong in." The captain's voice was even, but there was steel behind it. "You wouldn't have done it if she looked like someone's soccer mom." Mercer felt his pulse spike. "You don't know that." Reynolds tilted his head. "Don't I?" The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. And then Reynolds sat back down, his tone softening just slightly. "Kyle, I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference between a cop who made a bad call and a cop who doesn't belong here. Which one are you?" Mercer couldn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. Reynolds exhaled and shook his head. "Internal affairs will make their decision soon. But I suggest you stop waiting for someone else to tell you who you are." The word stung in a way Mercer hadn't expected. Because Reynolds wasn't just talking about his job. He was talking about his character. And Mercer realized that was the part of him that might not be salvageable. The ghosts of his past. The drive home felt different. Everything about the streets he had patrolled for years suddenly looked sharper, clearer. He watched the people walking their dogs, the kids on bikes, the men and women who had probably crossed his path at one point or another. How many had he stopped? How many had he profiled without even realizing it? How many had felt the same fear that Chief Carter had felt? It was a question he had never thought to ask before, and now it was all he could think about. He pulled into his driveway but didn't get out of the car. Instead, he sat there, staring at the darkened screen of his phone, his mind drifting back to a name. Malcolm Green, 18 years old, black, unarmed. Stopped outside a hardware store last year for matching the description of a robbery suspect. Mercer had been the one to detain him. The kid had been scared, really scared, but Mercer hadn't noticed at the time. Or maybe he had noticed and just didn't care. He had patted him down, questioned him, held him there for 40 minutes before finally confirming he had nothing to do with the crime. No apology, no explanation. Just, "You're free to go." Mercer had barely thought about it again. Until now. His stomach churned. What if Malcolm had fought back? What if he had gotten angry, resisted, yelled? What if things had escalated the way they had with Chief Carter? Would he have been just another name in a headline? Would Mercer have justified it? Would he have told himself, like he had told himself so many times before, that he was just doing his job? His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and searched the name. Malcolm Green. And there he was, alive, smiling in a recent photo, a freshman at Ohio State University. But the deeper Mercer scrolled, the heavier his chest felt. Because Malcolm hadn't forgotten. There were posts about it. A year ago, I was handcuffed outside a store because a cop thought I looked like a suspect. I was lucky. Others weren't. The words punched Mercer harder than any fist ever had. Because Malcolm didn't call them out by name. He didn't have to. Mercer knew. This wasn't just about one bad stop, one bad call, one bad day. It was a pattern. It was him. And for the first time, Kyle Mercer realized he was part of the problem. The first step. Mercer wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at Malcolm's post, at his own reflection in the windshield. But when he finally stepped out of his car, he did something he had never done before. He opened his laptop, and he started writing. Not a defense, not an excuse, a confession. Because for the first time in his life, Kyle Mercer wasn't just going to face the truth. He was going to own it. Owning the truth. Kyle Mercer had never been good with words. Words were messy. They could be twisted, manipulated, used against you. He had spent his entire career relying on actions instead. Firm commands, swift decisions, the kind of authoritative presence that didn't invite debate. But now, sitting at his desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, he had no badge, no authority, no control, just the weight of his own conscience pressing down on him. And for the first time, words were all he had. He hesitated before typing the first sentence. My name is Kyle Mercer. I've been a police officer for 20 years, and today, I was forced to confront a truth I should have seen a long time ago. His hands paused over the keys. His breath felt heavy in his chest. This wasn't an apology. Apologies were easy. People apologized all the time without meaning it. This was admission. An acknowledgement of something bigger than a single mistake. He kept writing. I stopped Chief Olivia Carter because I saw her as a threat. Not because she was doing anything wrong. Not because she broke the law. But because she was black in a neighborhood where I decided she didn't belong. And I didn't realize that in that moment, I wasn't just acting as an officer. I was enforcing a bias I had refused to acknowledge in myself. Mercer swallowed hard. The words on the screen felt like a confession in a courtroom. He could already hear the backlash coming. From the department, from his former colleagues, from people who would call him a traitor. But he pushed forward anyway. This wasn't the first time I made an unjustified stop. It was just the first time I was forced to face the consequences. And the truth is, if Chief Carter had been anyone else, any other black woman without a badge, without authority, without a title, I wouldn't be writing this right now. I would have gone home, slept just fine, and never thought about it again. He stopped, breathed, read the words back, and felt something inside him shift. For 20 years, he had been part of a system that told men like him they were always in the right, that their instincts were law, their actions justified, their power undeniable. And he had believed it. Until now. People like me don't like to admit when we're wrong. We hide behind procedure. We justify our choices. We tell ourselves we're just doing our jobs. But the truth is, we don't just enforce laws. We enforce our perceptions of who belongs, of who is dangerous, of who needs to be questioned. And that perception is broken. Mercer clenched his jaw. Because the next words, they were the hardest to write. If I weren't caught on video, if this wasn't a high-profile case, I would still be in uniform. I would still have my badge. And I would still be making the same calls, stopping the same people, believing that I was in the right. He stared at the blinking cursor, Everything inside him told him to stop, to delete it, to walk away. But he kept going. This is not an excuse. This is not a request for sympathy. I don't deserve sympathy. But if I can be honest about one thing, let it be this. I was wrong, and I don't know how to fix that. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The screen glowed in the dimly lit room, the words staring back at him like a verdict. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating. And then, the knock on the door. Mercer's pulse spiked. He turned toward the sound, his heart slamming against his ribs. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But deep down, he already knew who it was. He stood, moving slowly to the door, his footsteps heavy. His fingers hesitated on the handle before he finally pulled it open. Chief Olivia Carter stood on his porch, again. This time, there was no anger in her eyes, just something Mercer wasn't sure he deserved. A chance. The conversation that changed everything. They sat across from each other in his living room. Mercer had expected a lecture. He had expected more fury, more condemnation, more of the quiet disappointment that had been weighing on him since yesterday. But Carter just watched him. Finally, she spoke. "Why did you write it?" Mercer exhaled. "Because I needed to." "Needed to?" She arched a brow. "Or because you were trying to save face?" He met her gaze, forcing himself not to look away. "Because I can't lie to myself anymore." A long silence stretched between them. Then, Carter nodded, just once. "You want to know the truth, Mercer?" she asked, her voice softer than before. "You aren't the first cop to do this, and you won't be the last. But the difference between you and them, most of them never get caught. And even when they do, they refuse to see the problem." Mercer swallowed hard. "I see it now." "Good." Carter leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on her knees. "But seeing it isn't enough. What are you going to do about it?" Mercer hesitated, because he didn't know. He had spent his whole life believing in a system that protected men like him, a system that allowed him to make snap judgments without ever questioning them. Now that system had turned on him, and he had a choice. He could fight to get his badge back. He could frame himself as a victim of cancel culture, lean into the backlash, let the department protect him. Or he could change. Slowly, he met Carter's gaze. "I want to fix it." "You can't fix the past," she said. "But you can fix yourself." "How?" Carter studied him for a long moment. Then, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Mercer frowned, picking it up. Inside was a list. Names, numbers, organizations, programs, community groups, civil rights workshops, training initiatives aimed at reforming officers like him. "You want to make this right," Carter said. "Then start here." Mercer ran a hand over his face, glancing at the list. Some part of him had expected her to just demand his resignation, to tell him to disappear. But instead, she was giving him a chance to rebuild. Not as an officer, as a man. He swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay." Carter stood, smoothing out her jacket. "This isn't going to be easy, Mercer. You spent 20 years believing one thing. It's going to take more than an apology to undo it." "I know." She watched him for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. Just before she stepped outside, she paused. "You have a lot to make up for," she said. "Don't waste this." And then she was gone. Mercer sat there, staring at the folder in his hands. For the first time since this all started, he felt something strange settle inside him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. Because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he had to do. And this time, he wouldn't fail. The road to redemption. Kyle Mercer never thought he would see himself on the other side of the blue line. For 2 decades, he had worn the uniform, carried the badge, and wielded the authority that came with it. The law had always been something he enforced, not something he questioned. But now, stripped of his badge and thrown into a national controversy, he was the one being judged. And he had to decide, was he going to fight to save his pride, or fight to become a better man? The folder that Chief Olivia Carter had given him sat unopened on his kitchen table, staring back at him like a challenge he wasn't sure he could face. Community groups, civil rights initiatives, programs for law enforcement reform. It was a roadmap for something Mercer had never considered before: change. For hours he stared at the names on the pages, his fingers hovering over his phone, debating whether to make the calls. He had spent his whole life believing that good cops didn't need to change. That being one of the good ones meant he was exempt from the system's flaws. But what if being a good cop wasn't enough? What if his silence had made him just as guilty as the worst of them? What if he was never as good as he thought he was? A meeting with the past. It took him 3 days to work up the nerve to make the first call. Malcolm Green. The voice on the other end of the line said cautiously. Mercer exhaled, gripping his phone. Malcolm, it's Sergeant Mercer. Silence. Then Malcolm's voice hardened. Why the hell are you calling me? Mercer swallowed the lump in his throat. I need to talk to you. In person. A bitter laugh came through the line. You suddenly feel like apologizing for what you did to me last year. Mercer didn't flinch. He deserved that. Yeah, he said. And not just for what I did to you. I need to understand how many people I've done this to without realizing it. Malcolm was quiet. Then, you sure you're ready for that answer? Mercer exhaled. No, but I need it anyway. Another pause. Then Malcolm sighed. Fine. Meet me tomorrow at the Southside Community Center. 4 p.m. Don't be late. The call ended before Mercer could say anything else. His pulse hammered in his ears as he set the phone down. Tomorrow, he was going to face his past. The Southside Community Center. When Mercer pulled into the parking lot, the weight in his chest felt heavier than his old duty belt. The Southside Community Center was a place he had driven past 1,000 times during his patrols, but he had never once stepped inside. It was where activists held town halls, where families came together, where the people he had spent years profiling gathered to demand justice. Justice he had never truly listened to. Now he was walking straight into it. Inside, the air was thick with quiet conversation and the smell of coffee. Flyers for legal aid, protest events, and police accountability meetings lined the walls. A group of kids played basketball in the adjacent gym, their laughter echoing through the building. And then Malcolm Green appeared. He had grown in the last year. Broader shoulders, more confidence, the kind of self-assurance Mercer wished he had at 18. His eyes, however, held the same cold wariness that Mercer had seen in too many young black men when he approached them in uniform. I didn't think you'd actually show, Malcolm said, folding his arms. Mercer forced himself to meet the young man's gaze. Neither did I. Malcolm studied him. So, what do you want? A chance to clear your conscience. Mercer shook his head. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to understand. Malcolm arched a brow. Understand what? Mercer inhaled sharply. What it felt like. That day, when I stopped you. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly and motioned toward a chair at one of the tables. You really want to know? He said, sitting down. Fine. Let's talk. The other side of the badge. Malcolm's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. I was coming from the hardware store, just trying to get some stuff for my mom's house. Then, out of nowhere, you showed up. Mercer remained silent, listening. You didn't say, "Excuse me, sir." You didn't ask me anything first. You came at me like I was already guilty, like you knew I had done something before I even opened my mouth. Mercer felt his throat tighten. You made me put my hands on the hood of your car, patted me down like I was carrying something, Malcolm continued. People were watching me, man. People I knew. I was humiliated. Mercer clenched his fists under the table. He remembered that stop, but he didn't remember it like this. For him, it had been routine, standard procedure, just another day on patrol. For Malcolm, it had been something else entirely. "You kept me there for 40 minutes, Malcolm said, shaking his head. 40 damn minutes of people driving past, seeing me in cuffs, looking at me like I was a criminal. And when it was over, when you finally let me go, you didn't say a damn word." Mercer felt his chest tighten. You just walked away," Malcolm interrupted, like it didn't matter. Mercer swallowed hard, shame burning his skin. "Let me ask you something," Malcolm said, leaning forward. "If I had gotten mad that day, if I had pushed back, if I had raised my voice, what would you have done?" Mercer didn't answer, because he already knew. "I could have been another name," Malcolm said quietly. "Another headline, another statistic." Mercer looked down at his hands. "You think this is just about you and Chief Carter?" Malcolm shook his head. "This is about every stop like that. Every cop who does what you did and never thinks twice about it. You're just one of the few who got caught." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Mercer had spent his life believing that his actions were justified. But he had never truly considered the fear his presence created. He had never considered what it meant to be on the other side of that badge. Malcolm exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So tell me, Mercer, what are you gonna do now?" Mercer stared at him, heart pounding. And for the first time in his life, he didn't have an easy answer. A step toward something new. Mercer left the Southside Community Center feeling like a different man. Not redeemed, not forgiven, but changed. He wasn't sure what came next. He wasn't sure if he could fix the past. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going back to who he was before. That version of him was gone. And whoever he was going to become, that was up to him now. Redemption has no shortcuts. Kyle Mercer had always believed in control. Control over the streets, control over the job, control over himself. But as he sat in his darkened living room, staring at the folder of community reform initiatives Chief Carter had given him, he realized something for the first time in his life. He had never really been in control. The system had been. The expectations, the culture, the unspoken rules that told him which people to stop, which streets to patrol harder, which neighborhoods weren't meant for people who didn't belong. For 20 years, he had played by those rules without ever questioning them. Now, those rules had turned on him, and he was left standing at a crossroads. Did he fight for his badge? Try to claw his way back into a system that was already trying to bury him? Or did he do something that no one expected? Did he change? The meeting that would define him. The tension inside the Westbrook Police Department was suffocating. Mercer wasn't supposed to be here, not after his suspension. But there was unfinished business, and he wasn't going to leave it unsettled. Captain Reynolds was waiting in his office, arms folded as Mercer stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that told Mercer he had already made up his mind. "Mercer," Reynolds said flatly, "what the hell are you doing here?" Mercer set the folder down on the desk. "I'm resigning." Reynolds blinked, clearly not expecting that. "What?" Mercer exhaled, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "I'm resigning from the force, effective immediately." Reynolds studied him. "You know IA hasn't made their final decision yet. There's still a chance you—" "No," Mercer interrupted. "There's no coming back from this." Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "You really think leaving the force is going to fix what happened?" Mercer met his gaze. "No, but staying won't either." A long silence stretched between them. Then Reynolds shook his head, something between frustration and understanding flashing in his eyes. "So that's it. You walk away and hope people forget." Mercer hesitated before speaking. "I don't want them to forget. I want to be the reason things change." Reynolds arched a brow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Mercer tapped the folder. "By doing something real. Not just an apology tour. Not just PR cleanup. Real change. Reynolds stared at him for a long moment before finally exhaling. I don't know if you're serious or just desperate. Mercer gave a small, bitter laugh. Probably both. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You know, I've been in this job long enough to see a lot of guys go down. Most of them just dig their heels in. They fight it, claim they did nothing wrong. You're the first I've seen actually own it. Mercer nodded. Maybe that's the problem. Another beat of silence. Then Reynolds extended a hand. Mercer hesitated for only a moment before shaking it. Good luck, Mercer, Reynolds said. You're gonna need it. The first step into the unknown. Resigning from the force had felt like stepping off a cliff. For 20 years, the badge had been his identity. Without it, he was just another man trying to figure out who the hell he really was. But he wasn't starting from nothing. He was starting with the truth. And the first place he went wasn't home. It was back to the Southside Community Center. The moment he stepped inside, the air felt heavier. This time, people noticed him. A few side-eyed him. Some whispered to each other. Others openly glared. But he didn't walk with the authority of an officer anymore. He walked as a man asking for something more than forgiveness. He found Malcolm Green near the front desk, flipping through a stack of papers. When Malcolm saw him, his brows furrowed. You again? Mercer nodded. Yeah. Malcolm crossed his arms. What do you want now? Mercer exhaled. I quit the force. That got Malcolm's attention. What? I resigned, Mercer said simply. I'm not a cop anymore. Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then let out a dry laugh. What, you think quitting makes this better? No, Mercer admitted, but I want to help fix the thing I helped break. Malcolm arched a brow. And how do you plan to do that? Mercer hesitated, then handed Malcolm the folder Chief Carter had given him. I don't know where to start, he admitted, but I know I have to start somewhere. Malcolm eyed the folder, then looked back at Mercer. You actually serious about this? Mercer nodded. Malcolm studied him for another moment, then sighed. All right. Let's see if you mean it. From cop to advocate. The next few weeks were a trial by fire. Mercer attended his first community accountability meeting as a former officer, not as a cop defending his badge. And it was brutal. People confronted him, called him a disgrace, told him they didn't trust him. He listened. For the first time in his life, he listened. He joined anti-racial profiling training programs, learning about the very biases he had spent decades ignoring. He volunteered at the community center, not as an officer, but as a man trying to earn back the trust he had destroyed. And slowly, painfully, things began to shift. Not all at once, not in some grand moment of redemption, but in the small things. The way people started to see him, not as an enemy, but as someone who was truly trying. The way Malcolm stopped looking at him with pure resentment and started treating him as someone who could actually help. The way he stopped seeing himself as a cop first and as a person second. Redemption wasn't about words, it was about work. And Mercer was finally willing to put in the work. The interview that changed everything. Months later, Mercer found himself in front of a camera. The news had caught wind of his resignation. The viral story of the cop who had arrested his own chief and quit the force to reform himself was too big to ignore. Sitting across from the interviewer, he knew the whole country was about to hear his story. What do you say to the people who think this is all just an act? The reporter asked. Mercer exhaled. I say they have every right to doubt me. The reporter tilted her head. You don't think you deserve redemption. Mercer shook his head. Redemption isn't something you earn with an apology. It's something you prove every single day. The reporter nodded. And what would you say to your past self, the man you were before all of this? Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. I'd tell him to open his damn eyes. The camera light blinked. And with that, Kyle Mercer had finally become the man he should have been all along.